At 1:47 p.m. on May 29, 1944, a U.S. Army captain climbed onto the back of a tank destroyer, pointed a .50 caliber machine gun straight down into a German trench, and turned 40 trained soldiers into prisoners of geometry in less than 3 minutes. At dawn on May 29, 1944, Hill 209 still belonged to the Germans. 3 American attacks had already failed, and each failure left fewer men willing to try again. The Caesar Line stretched across the Italian hills like a locked door to Rome, and Villa Crocetta sat on its hinge. Whoever controlled that hill controlled the advance north. The first assault had been stopped by machine gun fire before the infantry reached the slope. The second died after artillery lifted and the Germans climbed back out of their dugouts untouched. The third collapsed when American shells fell short and killed their own men. By mid-morning, Companies A and C of the 168th Infantry Regiment were shattered, their officers shouting orders that no longer carried weight. Shock had replaced fear, and trust had been burned away by friendly fire. William W. Galt watched all of it from the battalion command post. He was not supposed to be there to fight. As the battalion S3, his job was to plan movements and analyze reports, not lead charges. He had never commanded men in direct combat, but he understood what the reports could not explain. The hill was not defeating the Americans by strength alone, but by position. German trenches on Hill 209 were deep, zigzagged, and carefully aligned. They could not be cleared by frontal fire. Artillery could not touch the men inside. Infantry assaults only fed the machine guns. From his vantage point, Galt saw the same pattern repeat itself. Men pushed forward, funneled into open ground, and cut down from prepared angles. Behind him were exhausted soldiers with nothing left to spend. Ahead of him was a trench system that had already proven it could not be broken the way the manuals demanded. Somewhere between those two facts, Galt realized that Hill 209 did not need to be attacked again. It needed to be closed. By early afternoon, the battalion had reached the edge of collapse. Companies B and D were ordered forward to replace the shattered units, but everyone knew the truth. This would be the 4th attempt against the same trenches, under the same guns, on the same ground. Nothing about the plan had changed. Galt studied the terrain instead of the orders. Hill 209 was not just high ground, it was a funnel. The German trench line ran along the crest, with only 2 practical escape routes along its zigzag legs. Everything else was earth, walls, and gravity. The Germans were safe only as long as those exits remained open. This was when Galt proposed something no staff officer was supposed to propose. Infantry alone would never clear those trenches. They needed a vehicle close enough to fire directly into them, not from 400 meters, not from a distance, from the edge. Destroyers had been assigned for support, but their doctrine was clear. Engage armor at range, avoid close infantry fighting. Their armor was thin. Their turrets were open. They were vulnerable. But they were also mobile steel walls with guns that could reach places artillery could not. He walked forward from the command post, leaving behind maps and radios. He found an M10 from the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion staging near olive trees at the base of the hill. Its crew was reloading ammunition, preparing for another cautious advance. The .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the rear ring sat unused. They asked a simple question. Who was manning the .50? No one was. The plan stopped being theoretical. Galt did not request permission. He informed the crew that he was coming with them. He would operate the machine gun himself. The tank destroyer would not fire from safety. It would drive straight to the trench. What he carried with him was not bravado or desperation. It was a childhood understanding of movement, blockage, and pressure. On Montana ranches, cattle were never chased head-on. Their options were narrowed until they had only one direction left. Hill 209, Galt saw that the Germans already stood inside a corral. All that remained was to close the gate. The M10 began moving at 1:15 p.m., its tracks grinding over uneven Italian soil as it climbed toward Hill 209. Captain Galt stood on the rear deck, gripping the .50 caliber Browning, while 3 ammunition boxes sat at his feet. The infantry followed 30 meters behind, using the tank destroyer as moving cover. Artillery found the range first. Shells fell to either side of the vehicle, fragments striking the hull with sharp metallic cracks. The M10 did not stop. At 200 meters, the MG-42S opened up. Tracers stitched across the front armor and ricocheted off the turret ring. One round struck the machine gun's receiver and glanced away. Galt felt the impact through his hands. 150 meters, a German anti-tank gun began traversing toward the M10 from the flank. The warning was shouted up to the turret. The M10's main gun swung, fired once, and erased the position in a cloud of dust and smoke. The road ahead stayed open. The destroyer pushed through an olive grove at the base of the hill. Branches snapped, bullets cracked overhead. Then the trees fell away, and the trench line came into full view, dark cuts in the earth, helmets moving inside, machine gun fire flashing from prepared angles. 75 meters, Galt racked the charging handle. The .50 came alive. He fired short bursts, walking the tracers along the trench to force heads down. The infantry closed behind him. M10 reached the lip of the trench. Galt signaled the driver to turn. The vehicle pivoted until its hull lay across one section of the trench, 29 tons of steel sealing it shut. The main gun covered the opposite leg. The exits were gone. Leaned forward and aimed straight down. The assault had become a dead end. From above the trench, the geometry was merciless. 40 German soldiers were packed into a narrow, zigzagging channel of earth with no room to maneuver and no route of escape. The design that had protected them from artillery and frontal fire now worked against them. Some looked up and froze. A few raised their hands. Others tried to climb the trench walls, only to be driven back by fire from their own rear positions. Discipline held them in place, even as their options vanished. Shouted for surrender. He waited. The answer came as bullets snapping into the dirt beside the men below. Fired. Caliber roared straight down into the trench, the recoil driving through his shoulders as spent casings rattled across the steel deck. He fired in controlled bursts, 5 seconds at a time, then paused, adjusted, and fired again. At this range, the rounds did not ricochet. They passed through sandbags, through bodies, through anything in their path. Smoke and dust filled the trench. Movement collapsed inward. The confined space amplified every impact. There was nowhere to crawl, nowhere to hide, nowhere to fall without landing on someone else. Within 3 minutes, the trench went silent. The barrel steamed, and the earth below him no longer moved. M10 had been stopped too long. Galt knew it, so did the crew. A tank destroyer sitting still on a contested hill was a target, and the Germans were already reacting. The vehicle lurched forward again, climbing past the shattered trench toward the villa. Behind them, American infantry moved into the position Galt had cleared, stepping over bodies piled where the trench narrowed. The machine guns that had ruled Hill 209 were finished. Weeks later, German armor and infantry began to counterattack from the northwest. Low silhouettes moved between buildings and folds in the ground. A self-propelled gun found its angle. The shot came without warning. Open turret, detonating inside the M10. The blast killed the crew instantly and hurled Galt forward across the machine gun he had just fired. The vehicle burned where it stood, ammunition cooking off as smoke rolled down the hillside. The trench was silent. The hill was still contested, but the position that had broken 3 American assaults was no longer alive. Galt was 24 years old. He had stood on a tank destroyer for less than an hour. In that time, He erased a fortified trench that had stopped a battalion and saved the men who would have been sent against it next. 209 would fall later when the Caesar line collapsed elsewhere. But on that afternoon in May, one man proved that terrain, angles, and blocked exits could be deadlier than any number of soldiers charging uphill. Captain William W. Galt's action did not win Hill 209, and it did not open the road to Rome that day. The Germans withdrew only after the Caesar line failed elsewhere. On paper, his attack changed little. In reality, it changed everything that mattered to the men on that slope. The trench he sealed would never fire again. The machine guns that had slaughtered 3 assaults were gone. Infantry units that had reached the edge of collapse were no longer asked to climb into certain death. The battalion advanced knowing one killing ground had been erased. The war, the army studied what happened at Villa Crocetta. Not the heroism, but the method. A tank destroyer designed to fight armor at range had been used as a physical barrier. An open turret, considered a flaw, became an advantage. Secondary weapons, normally ignored, became decisive. Edson was simple and uncomfortable. Doctrine fails when it ignores terrain. Galt did not invent a new weapon or a new tactic. He applied an old principle he had learned long before the war. You do not chase what you want to control. You close off its options until it cannot move at all. In Italian hillside in 1944, that principle turned a trench into a trap. Galt was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His name appears on a building in Montana. Most people who pass it will never know why. For the men who would have died climbing Hill 209, the lesson was unmistakable. The war was not always decided by numbers or firepower. Geometry. What happened on Hill 209 forces an uncomfortable question that most war stories avoid. Asterisk, asterisk. Why did it take 4 failed assaults, dozens of dead Americans, and near collapse before the obvious solution appeared? Asterisk, asterisk. The answer is not cowardice, incompetence, or bad luck. It is doctrine. The U.S. Army of 1,944 was built on rules written for predictable battles. Infantry advances were planned around artillery preparation, maneuver by fire, and momentum. Tank destroyers were assigned a narrow role. Hunt enemy armor at distance, avoid close combat, preserve mobility. Staff officers planned. Line officers executed. Deviations were discouraged, because deviations created chaos. Galt violated every one of those boundaries. He was a staff officer who left his command post. He climbed onto a vehicle not assigned to him. He operated a weapon outside his specialty. And he put himself in a position Doctrine explicitly warned against. If he had survived, his career might have ended anyway. Doctrine had already failed long before Galt acted. The German defense on Hill 209 was not clever because it was complex. It was clever because it was simple. The trenches were placed where infantry had to approach uphill. The zigzag design prevented enfilade fire. Dugouts nullified artillery. Machine guns overlapped fields of fire. The defenders did not need initiative. They only needed Americans to behave as expected. Did. Suppress with artillery, advance infantry, absorb casualties, pull back. Each failure weakened morale. Each delay increased German confidence. The battlefield became a machine that converted obedience into losses. It recognized something most battlefield commanders miss under pressure. Asterisk, asterisk. The fight was no longer tactical, it was geometric. Asterisk, asterisk. The Germans were not winning because they were shooting better. They were winning because their position created forced movement. Americans had only one way forward. Germans had several ways to kill them. That's why the tank destroyer mattered. Because of its gun. It was powerful because of its mass and shape. 29 tons of steel placed at the right angle turned a defensive system into a prison. The moment the trench exits were blocked, the German advantage inverted. Cover became confinement. Discipline became paralysis. Training became irrelevant. 50 caliber machine gun did not win the fight by volume alone. It won because it fired into a space that could not disperse force. Modern weapons amplify geometry. When geometry is wrong, bravery becomes waste. This is the part of the story that rarely appears in Medal of Honor citations. Citations focus on courage because courage is easier to honor than analysis. But courage without understanding had already killed dozens of men on that hill. His background mattered more than his rank. He saw a shoot. Marching teaches lessons that do not appear in infantry manuals. You cannot overpower a herd. You shape the environment so movement becomes inevitable. Gates matter more than force. Pressure works only when escape routes are controlled. Animals, like soldiers under fire, choose the option that feels least dangerous, even if it is fatal. Germans in that trench were not irrational. They stayed because climbing out meant exposure and retreat meant their own guns. From inside the trench, staying felt safer than moving. That instinct killed them. It is not a moral judgment. It is a mechanical one. War rewards people who understand constraints. The U.S. Army quietly adjusted. Tank destroyers and later tanks were used more aggressively in infantry support. Secondary weapons gained importance. Close-range coordination improved. Not because of one captain, but because reality had exposed a flaw doctrine could not ignore. The lesson remained incomplete. Same problem. Over-reliance on systems instead of understanding space. Technology changes, but geometry does not. Drones, missiles, sensors all amplify effects, but they do not replace fundamentals. If an enemy is allowed freedom of movement while you are constrained, firepower only accelerates failure. This action also highlights a darker truth. Innovation in war often comes from desperation, not planning. Institutions reward conformity. Breakthroughs usually come from individuals willing to accept personal risk beyond what rules permit. Many of them die before their insight is recognized. Did not live to explain his reasoning. Others reconstructed it afterward. His Medal of Honor citation contains errors because memory is imperfect under shock. The official record simplifies what was, in reality, a precise act of environmental control executed under fire. The men who followed him up the hill did not need to understand geometry. They only needed the guns to stop firing. From their perspective, the trench went silent, and that silence meant survival. History often treats such moments as anomalies, one-off heroics, unlikely to repeat. That is comforting because it allows institutions to avoid deeper reflection. But Hill 209 was not unique. Similar mistakes and similar solutions appear across wars, eras, and technologies. Where soldiers are funneled into predictable paths, someone else controls the fight. Whenever escape routes are ignored, someone else decides outcomes. Whenever doctrine overrides observation, casualties accumulate until someone breaks the pattern. On the 29th of May 1944, that someone was a 4-year-old captain standing on an open-topped tank destroyer holding a machine gun, applying a lesson learned far from any battlefield. Not win Rome. He did not survive the day. He did not rewrite doctrine on paper. But for a few minutes, on an Italian hillside, he reminded war of something it never forgets for long. Control the space, and the fight will resolve itself. The men who studied Villa Croqueta after the war did not talk about bravery first. They talked about angles, distances, and timing. They drew diagrams of the trench line and marked where the M10 had stopped. They measured the width of the trench, the turning points of the zigzags, and the arcs of fire that had once protected it. Emerged from those studies was not a myth, but a warning. The German position had been strong only because it forced American behavior. Once that behavior changed, the position collapsed instantly. No reinforcement arrived in time. No countermeasure could be deployed fast enough. The trench had been designed to defeat predictable assault, not inversion of control. It's the quiet difference between tactics and traps. Tactics respond to what the enemy does. Traps determine what the enemy can do. The Germans had built a tactical position. Galt turned it into a trap by eliminating choice. Distinction matters far beyond Hill 209. Throughout the war, the most lethal moments were rarely prolonged firefights. They were brief collapses caused by sudden loss of options. Encirclements, blocked bridges, sealed streets, cut supply routes. These were not glamorous victories, but they ended fights faster than attrition ever could. Military culture tends to underplay them because they lack spectacle. There is no dramatic charge, no long exchange of fire, no cinematic duel, just silence, followed by bodies. Crocetta was one of those moments. Not fail because they were poorly trained. They failed because their environment betrayed them. Once sealed in place, their individual skill no longer mattered. A machine gun firing downward into confined space does not care about courage, ideology, or experience. Uncomfortable to acknowledge because it reduces human conflict to mechanics. But war has always been mechanical at its core. Uniforms change, flags shift, but gravity, angles, and movement remain constant. Every battlefield is a three-dimensional problem disguised as a moral one. Leaders who grasp this early save lives. Those who do not usually learn it too late. The story survives because it exposes this truth without ornament. There is no claim that he felt fear or anger, no speculation about his thoughts, only recorded actions and their consequences. The clarity makes the lesson harder to ignore. Not outshoot the Germans. That difference explains why 40 men died in minutes where hundreds had survived hours of bombardment. Artillery failed because it struck space, not people. Infantry failed because it advanced into controlled lanes. The tank destroyer succeeded because it removed freedom. Warfare still struggles with this balance. Sensors provide awareness but not control. Firepower creates pressure but not resolution. Victory still requires moments where the enemy's choices collapse to zero. What happens? The fight ends abruptly. Principles appeared in urban fighting in France, street clearing in Germany, and later conflicts across the world. Armored vehicles used as barriers. Infantry supported not by fire alone, but by obstruction. Enemy movement restricted until resistance became impossible. These were not new ideas. They were old truths rediscovered under stress. Galt's death ensured his role would be remembered as sacrifice rather than instruction. That is how institutions absorb lessons without fully confronting them. We honor the individual so we do not have to interrogate the system that made his action necessary. Systems do not change unless stories are understood. Hill 209 was not taken because of one heroic act. It fell because the German line collapsed elsewhere. But the trench Galt sealed never mattered again. It was removed from the equation. That is the quiet power of environmental control. It does not need to be decisive everywhere. It only needs to remove key points of failure. Men of the 168th Infantry Regiment, that removal meant the difference between another uphill assault and a chance to survive the day. Strip the story down to its essentials, what remains is almost unsettling in its simplicity. A battlefield is a problem of movement. and fire becomes inevitable. Ignore movement, and fire becomes meaningless. 1944, a young American captain understood that when others did not. He acted on it, paid the price, and left behind a lesson still relevant long after the echoes of his machine gun faded from the hillside. What makes Hill 209 linger in military history is not the number of men killed or the medal that followed, but how quickly the fight changed once control replaced force. For hours, the battlefield had absorbed energy without yielding. Artillery fell, men advanced, blood was spent, and nothing moved. Then, in minutes, a single shift in positioning erased an entire defensive node. This kind of collapse is rare, and it is rarely accidental. The German trench system was designed with one assumption: the attacker would remain outside it. Everything about its shape supported that belief. The zigzags broke lines of fire. The dugouts defeated shelling. The MG-42S punished frontal movement. But nowhere in its design did it account for a vehicle deliberately placed to deny exits from above. Defensive works often fail not because they are weak, but because they are optimized for one problem and blind to another. Once the problem changes, their strength becomes liability. The U.S. Army would encounter this repeatedly in Italy. Hilltop positions that seemed unassailable from the front were abandoned when cut off. Villages defended for weeks fell in hours when supply roads were severed. The pattern was consistent. Firepower stalled battles. Geometry ended them. Action fit that pattern precisely. Distance across the hill, he eliminated the ability of one position to influence the fight. That was enough. Warfare rarely requires total destruction. It requires removal of leverage. This distinction is often misunderstood by those far from combat. They imagine victory as conquest, annihilation, or dominance. Soldiers experience it differently. Victory is when a place stops killing your friends. From that perspective, Galt succeeded completely. The men who followed behind the M10 did not care whether the Caesar line held or fell elsewhere. They cared that the trench in front of them no longer contained living weapons. The difference between strategic success and tactical relief is sometimes measured in meters and minutes. The price of that relief was immediate. The open turret that allowed Galt to fire downward also left him exposed. German gunners responded as trained. A self-propelled gun found the angle and fired once. That was enough. The same geometry that trapped the Germans now trapped the Americans in a stationary vehicle. This symmetry is not poetic. It is instructive. Corresponding vulnerability. Open space allows observation but invites fire. Mass blocks movement but draws attention. Speed avoids targeting but limits control. No position is dominant forever. He accepted that trade without illusion. He did not expect survival. His action makes sense only if understood as a calculated exchange. One vehicle and its crew for a position that had already cost dozens of infantrymen and threatened many more. Calculations are rarely acknowledged openly, but they underpin every hard decision in combat. The difference is that most are spread across units and time. Galt compressed it into minutes. After the war, Doctrine incorporated fragments of this lesson while avoiding its moral weight. Manuals spoke of combined arms, mutual support, and flexibility. They did not say that sometimes the correct move is to deliberately expose yourself to eliminate a killing zone. Truth remains uncomfortable. Standoff solutions, precision weapons, remote engagement. These reduce risk, but they do not eliminate the fundamental problem of movement. When an enemy controls space, distance alone cannot solve it. Someone still has to close, block, and hold. 209 reminds us that technology does not replace presence. It only changes how presence is expressed. 50 caliber machine gun mattered because it was physically there, above the trench, At the exact moment options disappeared. No sensor, no map, no radio order could substitute for that. His upbringing gave him an advantage no manual could teach. He had learned early that control does not require chasing. It requires patience and positioning. That lesson, applied in war, becomes lethal. The tragedy is not that he died. Soldiers die in every battle. The tragedy is that such understanding is often recognized only after loss. Hill 209 faded from headlines. Rome fell days later. The war moved on. But the principle did not vanish. It resurfaced wherever armies fought over constrained terrain. Cities, bridges, valleys, corridors. Those who remembered Villa Crocetta recognized it immediately. Those who did not relearned it the hard way. Matters beyond medals and memorials. It is not a tale of bravery meant to inspire. It is a warning meant to instruct. Or geometry, and courage bleeds away. Understand it, and battles end faster than anyone expects. There is a final, quieter layer to Hill 209 that rarely gets discussed because it does not fit comfortably into heroic narratives or tactical manuals. The cost of waiting. Galt acted was not just a tactical failure, but a psychological one. Each attack taught the defenders that their position worked. Each withdrawal taught the attackers that the hill could not be taken without unacceptable loss. This feedback loop is how battles stagnate and how morale erodes long before units are destroyed. Early afternoon on May 29th, the German defenders believed Hill 209 was secure. The American infantry believed it was cursed. Both beliefs were wrong, but belief matters more than truth in combat. Galt shattered both assumptions at once. For the Germans, the trench stopped being protection and became a coffin. For the Americans, watching from below, the impossible position was erased in minutes. That reversal matters more than the body count. It broke the psychological stalemate. Though the hill itself was not taken that day, the fight was no longer frozen. Movement resumed. Initiative returned. The sense of inevitability that had settled over the slope lifted. This is why singular actions can matter even when they do not change the map. Wars are not only contests of territory, they are contests of expectation. Whoever convinces the other side that resistance is futile wins long before surrender is signed. The Germans withdrew from the Caesar Line days later, not because of Hill 209 alone, but because similar pressure was applied elsewhere. Positions were bypassed, cut off, or rendered irrelevant. The line failed as a system, not as a series of isolated fights. 209 was one small crack in that system. Galt did not know the broader outcome when he climbed onto the M10. He did not know Rome would fall on June 4th. He did not know his action would be studied or commemorated. He acted because he recognized an immediate truth. Doing nothing would kill more men than doing something dangerous. That is the decision space real leaders occupy. Not between good and bad options, but between bad and worse ones. In hindsight, it is tempting to frame his choice as inevitable or obvious. It was neither. It required stepping outside role, doctrine, and expectation. Most officers in his position would have stayed at the command post and written a better plan for the next assault. The plan would have failed. Because obedience is reproducible. Insight is not. Insight appears unpredictably, often in people whose backgrounds do not match the institution's ideals. Thatcher's son understood terrain better than a field manual written by committee. That is not an insult to training. It is a reminder of its limits. Training prepares you for known problems. War punishes you with new ones. Hill 209 was not a problem of firepower. It was a problem of confinement. Once that was recognized, the solution became brutally simple. Simple does not mean easy. Open vehicle within range of enemy guns is not courage in the abstract. It is a calculated acceptance of likely death for a specific effect. That distinction matters because it separates recklessness from intent. He was not reckless. He was precise. His death was not tragic because it was meaningless. It was tragic because it was necessary under conditions that should never have required it. Is the deeper critique hidden inside the story. When institutions fail to adapt, individuals pay the price. That innovation in war often arrives too late for the innovator. The system learns. The individual dies. And survives only if someone tells it clearly, without romance. Control space. Remove exits. Force decisions. End fights. Ignore those principles, and no amount of bravery will save you. That truth has not aged. In every trench, every street, every corridor where movement is constrained and doctrine grows rigid. 209 was one hillside in Italy. The geometry it revealed is everywhere. Hill 209 ultimately teaches something more uncomfortable than tactics or bravery. It exposes how wars are often lost in increments long before they are lost in battles. By the time Captain Galt climbed onto the M10, the danger was no longer just German machine guns. It was institutional inertia. The U.S. Army in Italy was not incompetent. It was experienced, disciplined, and adaptive by most historical standards. But experience can harden into habit, and habit into blindness. Repeated success in earlier campaigns had reinforced a belief that problems could always be solved by applying more of the same. More artillery, more coordination, more persistence. When that belief fails, the response is usually not innovation but escalation. 209 was a classic escalation trap. Each failed assault justified the next by logic that sounded reasonable on paper. The artillery would be heavier, the coordination tighter, the infantry better prepared. What no one wanted to admit was that the fundamental relationship between attacker and terrain had not changed. The Germans were not being worn down. They were waiting. Where many armies falter, attrition is seductive because it feels like progress. Casualties accumulate, ammunition is expended, reports are written. Activity replaces insight. But attrition only works when both sides are bleeding equally. On Hill 209, they were not. When defenders were conserving strength, the Americans were consuming it. Galt recognized this imbalance not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because he was looking at a different variable. Most officers were focused on firepower. He was focused on movement. Most saw a trench as a fortification. He saw it as a container. Shift in perspective is rare under pressure. Stress narrows attention. Training reinforces familiar patterns. Innovation feels irresponsible when lives are already being lost. Yet it is precisely at that moment that deviation becomes necessary. The paradox here that militaries struggle to resolve. Discipline is essential for survival, but excessive discipline can make adaptation impossible. Soldiers must follow orders. Yet wars are won by people who recognize when orders no longer fit reality. Cross that line deliberately. He observed pattern, identified constraint, and acted decisively. His solution worked not because it was dramatic, but because it was aligned with the physics of the environment. Once the M10 blocked the trench exits, the outcome was predetermined. The machine gun did not decide the fight. The positioning did. Distinction matters because it reframes what we mean by firepower. Firepower is not just about caliber, rate of fire, or explosive yield. It is about how force interacts with space. A single weapon, correctly placed, can achieve what hundreds of rounds cannot when misapplied. 209 is therefore not a story about killing efficiency. It is a story about problem framing. The Germans framed the hill as a killing ground. The Americans initially accepted that frame. Galt rejected it and imposed a new one. Once he did, the Germans had no response because their defense was optimized for the old frame. This is why truly effective tactics often look unfair or one-sided in hindsight. They exploit assumptions the enemy did not realize they were making. After the war, analysts could trace the logic clearly. But clarity after the fact is cheap. The cost was paid in blood before the lesson was learned. Also worth confronting what this story does not say. It does not suggest that individual heroism is a substitute for sound planning. Galt's action was necessary because planning had failed. A system that routinely requires such sacrifices is broken. Celebrating the individual without examining the failure risks repeating it. The pattern appears repeatedly in military history. Individuals who solve problems locally are elevated as heroes, while the systemic conditions that made their actions necessary remain intact. The institution learns just enough to survive, but not enough to prevent recurrence. 209 did influence doctrine, but indirectly and unevenly. Tank destroyers and later tanks were increasingly used in infantry support roles. Combined arms coordination improved. Yet the deeper lesson, prioritizing spatial control over procedural adherence, remains difficult to institutionalize. Exists standardization. You can teach how to fire a weapon. You can drill how to clear a trench. You can codify formations and call for fire procedures. But you cannot easily teach when to abandon them. That judgment depends on context, experience, and the willingness to accept risk. Organizations prefer rules because rules reduce uncertainty. Geometry increases it. His ranching background mattered because it trained him to think in constraints rather than instructions. Animals do not follow orders. They respond to pressure and opportunity. That mindset translates uncomfortably well to combat, where enemies also behave according to incentives rather than plans. Germans in the trench were not suicidal. They were trapped by incentives. Staying felt safer than moving. Moving felt immediately fatal. Once those incentives were engineered, behavior followed predictably. It is not dehumanization. It is recognition of how humans behave under extreme stress. Understanding this is crucial because modern warfare increasingly takes place in environments where movement is constrained. Cities, tunnels, bunkers, narrow terrain. Technology has increased lethality, but it has not changed the basic equation. If anything, it has made mistakes more costly. Sensors and precision weapons can create the illusion of control, but they do not replace it. A drone can see a trench. It cannot block it. A missile can destroy a position. It cannot always do so without collateral damage or delay. Eventually, someone must still occupy space. 209 reminds us that presence remains decisive. It also raises ethical questions that cannot be ignored. Sealing a trench and firing downward leaves no room for surrender once firing begins. This is brutal, but war often is. The moral responsibility lies not in the moment of execution, but in the conditions that made it inevitable. The Germans surrendered immediately. The outcome might have been different. They did not, likely because their doctrine and discipline punished surrender. That, too, is part of the geometry of war. Internal constraints shape external outcomes. Galt gave them an option. It was rejected. What followed was mechanical. This is uncomfortable to confront because it strips war of narrative comfort.